Officer Jenkins drove down the empty streets of Fairview Heights, a quiet suburban neighborhood famous for its peacefulness. The sun was already dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows on the road. By this time, the neighborhood was usually quiet, and the silence was broken only by the faint chirping of crickets and the occasional rumble of distant traffic. Jenkins glanced around, sighing as he drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. He had expected to get used to the quietness of his shift since he was transferred to the neighborhood 2 days ago. But he was finding it hard to adjust, and the slow pace and tranquility of the suburban neighborhood was rubbing him off the wrong way. Jenkins preferred being out in the tough neighborhoods, places where he could cuff and detain black miscreants. But at Fairview, he felt everything was already perfect. There was hardly any need for officers except the once-in-a-blue-moon noise disturbance calls. As he glanced around, looking for anything that could occupy his time, he caught sight of a sleek black sedan rolling slowly through the neighborhood. Immediately, Jenkins caught sight of the driver. His interest piqued. He immediately felt the car was out of place. The neighborhood was known for being a safe haven for the rich and wealthy. It was very possible that this driver was casing any of the houses. Jenkins immediately straightened up in his seat, slowly following the movement of the car. It wasn't like anything illegal was happening, but something about the car's presence and the driver, a black woman, didn't sit right with him. His day so far had been slow. This could be the universe making it up to him, Jenkins thought to himself. Without much thought, he flipped on his lights and siren and pulled up behind the car. His heart was already beating rapidly with excitement. There was never any traffic in the neighborhood, and he immediately tagged behind the car, and the driver started to slow down. The car smoothly pulled over to the curb. Jenkins parked, his fingers flying immediately to the door handle. But as he got down from the car, he tried to think of a legitimate reason for the stop. The truth was that he had nothing. He had stopped her because he didn't believe the driver was up to any good. He didn't trust black people in white neighborhoods, and he desperately needed something to break the boredom of his shift. She had not been driving carelessly, and she had no traffic violations, but he just had this feeling that the driver was up to no good. As Jenkins walked toward the car, he kept his hand near the gun holster on his hip. "Violent bunch," he muttered to himself. He glanced into the driver's window. He wanted to make sure her hands were visible. Jenkins tapped on her window, motioning for her to roll down the windows. The black woman with short-cropped hair slowly rolled down the window, remaining calm and collected behind the wheel. "Good evening, officer," she said. Her voice was so smooth and calm that it caught Jenkins off guard. "License and registration," Jenkins said curtly, ignoring her greeting. His eyes scanned the interior of the car, looking for anything that might confirm his suspicion that she was up to something bad. But all he saw was a neat interior, a work bag on the passenger seat, and a water bottle in the cup holder. The woman glanced up at him, focusing her eyes on him. Jenkins saw the flicker of confusion briefly flash across her face. "Is there a reason you pulled me over, officer?" Jenkins stiffened at the question. He didn't like being questioned, especially not by someone who had no business driving through this part of town. "License and registration," he repeated, his voice sharper this time. The woman sighed. She then slowly reached into the glove compartment to retrieve the requested documents. Jenkins could not help but notice the calmness and grace she used to carry out everything without any hint of hurry. But he knew it could all be a play. His instincts were never wrong, and he knew that she had to be up to something bad. He watched her hands carefully, almost willing something suspicious to happen. But if she was up to something, she was not making it easy for him. She moved smoothly, without any slight trace of being worried or anxious. The woman slowly handed Jenkins her license and registration, her eyes calmly meeting his. "Again, officer, I'm happy to comply, but can you tell me why I was pulled over?" Jenkins stared at the license, reading her name aloud, as if trying to pin something on her. "Renee Thompson," he muttered. Her name didn't sound like she was from around here, but you can never tell with these people, he thought to himself. Her persistence in asking why she was pulled over was starting to irritate him, and he was not going to have it. "I'll ask the questions here, Ms. Thompson," he replied abruptly. Renee raised an eyebrow at his response as she tried to make sense of what was going on, but she didn't argue. If he wanted a reason to find her at fault, she was not going to give him one, Renee thought to herself. She simply waited, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. For Officer Jenkins, there was something about this woman's calm composure that irritated him so much he couldn't place a finger on it, but it made him feel like he was out of control. "Step out of the car," Jenkins ordered, taking a step back. Renee blinked, trying to be sure she had heard correctly. "Step out of the car? Officer, what's this about? I haven't done anything wrong." Jenkins could feel his anger boiling at this point. He didn't have an answer to why he was asking her to step out of the vehicle, except his instincts. "I said step out of the car," he repeated. For a moment, there was silence. Renee's expression remained calm and composed, but Jenkins could see the way her eyes narrowed slightly, assessing him and the surroundings. He knew she was weighing her options, and for no particular reason, it annoyed him. He couldn't tell if it was the look on her face. There was no panic or fear, just this calmness as if she knew something that he did not. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the car door. "All right, officer, I'm stepping out," she replied. Jenkins couldn't help but notice the calm in her voice and how smooth her composure was. Jenkins couldn't push down the feeling of frustration bubbling up. This was not how she was meant to act, he thought to himself. She wasn't behaving like most people did when pulled over by police officers. There was no explanation for the level of confidence she was exhibiting. He was used to people trying to justify themselves, trying to convince him that they weren't doing anything wrong. But Renee Thompson... She just stood there, looking him dead in the eye. Like he was any other guy on the street, it was obvious that she wasn't intimidated by him at all. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Jenkins asked, his tone sharper than intended. He hadn't meant to let that question slip, but now it had slipped from his lip. He had no choice but to keep going. Renee blinked, her eyes fixed on him. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Jenkins said, crossing his arms, trying everything possible to regain the upper hand. "What are you doing here? You don't live around here, do you?" Renee's jaw tightened at the question, but she remained calm. "I don't see how that's relevant to why you pulled me over, officer." Jenkins could feel the control of the situation slipping further out of his grasp. He hadn't expected her to push back like this. She was meant to be worried and anxious about what he would find. Most people would have started making excuses by now, maybe even apologizing for whatever they thought they did wrong. But Renee wasn't giving him that satisfaction. He had to find a way to make it obvious that he was in charge here. "It's relevant because this is a quiet, safe neighborhood, and I need to make sure everything is in order," Jenkins snapped. "And right now, you're not making things easy." Renee took a slow breath, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm not making things easy. Officer, I've complied with everything you've asked. I'm standing here, outside of my car, answering your questions, despite the fact that I still don't know why you stopped me in the first place. My papers are in order. I wasn't driving over the speed limit, and I don't have any outstanding warrants. So, what's the problem?" Renee's calmness was rubbing Jenkins off the wrong way, and he was getting easily agitated. Deep down, Jenkins knew he was digging himself into a deeper hole, but he couldn't stop. Something about this woman? The way she refused to let him intimidate her made him feel small, and he hated that feeling. "You're acting suspicious," Jenkins blurted out before he could think of something better to say. Renee's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Suspicious? How, exactly?" Jenkins opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He tried to think of a valid reason to justify his actions, but he came up empty. His heart pounded heavily in his chest as his face flushed with frustration. The tension in the air was extremely noticeable. Renee stood still, her gaze fixed on Officer Jenkins's. He couldn't back down now, not after everything he'd said. But just as Jenkins thought he was finally gaining the upper hand, Renee did something unexpected. She took a small step closer, her voice low and steady. "Officer, I suggest you think carefully about what you're doing right now." Jenkins swallowed hard, trying to remove the lump that had formed in her throat. Something about the way she spoke. It wasn't a threat. It was more of a promise. A warning. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jenkins shot back, but his voice lacked the confidence it had before. Renee's eyes met his, calm and unblinking. "I'm giving you a chance to reconsider before you make this situation worse, officer." Jenkins stared at her. He could not understand why this woman was so confident and calm. He had no idea what she meant, but he couldn't deny that he was slightly worried about her warning. He felt the cold sweat trickle down his back as he tried to remember the last time he had felt like this on duty. "Sentai." Jenkins stood in front of Renee, his breath catching in his throat. He wasn't used to people talking to him like this, especially not with the kind of calm confidence that Renee displayed. If not for anything, he expected her to be worried and anxious about what she might have done wrong. He wasn't planning on losing control of the situation, but he was starting to feel like he wasn't in control anymore. Renee stood tall, her posture relaxed, with her eyes focused on Jenkins. Her crossed arms and body language was telling Jenkins that this was a woman that hardly ever got intimidated. The fact that she wasn't acting hostile or being confrontational was frustrating to Jenkins, because at this rate, he was going to have no reason to detain her or hold her much longer. "Why don't you check my license and registration, officer?" Renee suggested, her voice even and unbothered. "You'll find everything you need." Jenkins felt the heat rising to his chest. She was right, of course. He had absolutely no reason to keep her standing out here. But something about the way she spoke to him made him feel emasculated. He needed to prove that he was the authority and law here. That feeling kept him from backing down. His hand moved toward his radio, but on second thought he hesitated. Calling for backup would make him look foolish. She had done nothing, and there was no crime he could tie her to. At the end of the day, she was just a woman driving slowly across the neighborhood. He cleared his throat, ignoring the voices in his head telling him to back down and let her go. "I'll check them in a minute," he said, trying to regain his footing. "But first, I need to ask you a few more questions." Renee blinked slowly, then nodded. She took a deep sigh, but she wasn't going to give the officer the benefit of seeing her frustration. "All right, officer," she said softly. "Go ahead." Jenkins straightened, searching for something, anything, to justify his actions. "Where are you coming from?" "Work," Renee replied without hesitation. "I'm on my way home." "And what do you do for work?" he pressed. There was a brief pause, and for the first time he caught the very brief change in Renee's calm composure. Who was she, and why was she avoiding talking about her work? He thought to himself. Renee's eyes narrowed as she contemplated the best answer to give. She knew he would probably not believe her or take it seriously, but she still answered, "I'm in the military." Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "The military?" He couldn't hide the skepticism in his voice when he replied. "What branch?" "The Army," Renee said, her voice still steady, but now Jenkins could sense a faint tension beneath it. There was definitely something going on, Jenkins thought to himself. There was no way this petite black woman was in the military. Why was she lying to him? And what was she really up to, he wondered. He noticed that she had quickly regained her composure as if she was done playing his games. "I'm stationed nearby," she replied. Jenkins nodded slowly, though he didn't believe her. There was no way this woman, this black woman, was military. But he couldn't deny that she had the confidence and composure of a military agent, but he knew it was all a lie. He had caught it in her expression when he asked about her work earlier. It was normal for people to lie to police officers during stops, but he knew that the truth usually made its way to the surface sooner or later. "All right," he muttered, glancing down at her license again as if hoping it would give him some reason to take her into custody. He could swear that she was up to something, but he was just having a hard time figuring it out. As he stared at the driver's license, all he saw was her name and address. Everything seemed to be in order. There was nothing suspicious here. Jenkins knew that if she was white, he probably wouldn't have stopped her, but years of bias and discrimination had left him convinced that every black person was up to no good. He knew he should end this. Hand back her license and tell her she was free to go. But there was just something inside him, a small dark part he wouldn't admit to himself, that didn't want to let her walk away just yet, at least not easily. "Where exactly are you headed?" Jenkins asked, his tone sharper now. Renee could sense that he was getting more frustrated at not finding anything to hold her to as a crime. "Home," Renee repeated. Her patience was growing thin by the minute. "I live just a few blocks from here. You can see my address on my license." "I'm sure you know this neighborhood better than I do, officer." She gave a slight shrug, but Jenkins caught the undeniable hint of a smirk on her lips. His jaw clenched. Was she mocking him? He thought to himself. She had a way with words that left him feeling small after every response. "Just answer the question, Ms. Thompson," he spat. "I did," Renee said simply, her voice still calm and confident. For a moment, the two of them stood there in the dimming light of the evening. It was like a quiet battle of wills playing out between them. Jenkins could feel his control over the situation slipping further and further away, and it annoyed him so much. He was the officer here, the one in charge. But Renee wasn't treating him as such. Renee's gaze softened for an instant, and for the first time her tone shifted slightly as if she were trying to reach him. "Officer," she said quietly, "I don't know what you think is happening here, but I've done nothing wrong. You know that, and I know that. So why are you still pushing this? I've explained and done everything you asked for. I don't understand why I'm still being held by the roadside." Jenkins could feel his heart beating loudly. She was right. He had no reason to keep holding her, but his bias wouldn't let him. Her words forced him to actually think about the real reason he'd pulled her over. He knew perfectly well it wasn't because of any violation or suspicious behavior. It was because, in his mind, she didn't belong here, in this neighborhood. The realization made him feel small, but he pushed it down, refusing to acknowledge it. "I'm just doing my job," he said gruffly, trying to convince himself, but even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow. Renee shook her head slightly. Jenkins could see the disappointment in her eyes. "No, officer," she said softly. "This isn't your job." For a moment, Jenkins didn't know how to respond. There was something about the way she said it that sent shivers down his spine. This woman acted like she was the authority here, and she was the one in control. He hated it. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Step back to the front of the car," he ordered, his voice sounding cold. Renee didn't move at first. She stood there, watching him. Her eyes were focused on him as if she were warning him not to do this. After a long moment, she let out a slow breath and took a step forward, moving to stand in front of her car. Jenkins saw the moment she decided to obey, even before she moved. He followed her to the front of the car, but at this point, he didn't know what he was doing anymore, only that he couldn't let go of this, couldn't admit that he'd made a mistake. "What's next?" Renee asked, her voice calm but with an edge to it now. She wasn't playing along anymore. "Are you going to search my car? Frisk me? What exactly are you hoping to find, officer?" Jenkins took a step back, surprised by the sudden change in countenance. "Don't get smart with me," he yelled. "I'm not," Renee replied. "I'm just trying to understand why we're still standing here. You've got my license. You've got my registration. Everything checks out. And yet you're still treating me like a suspect in some crime I know nothing about." The words felt like someone had sucker punched him in the gut. "I'm not—" "You are." Renee cut him off, her voice firm now. "You're treating me like I've done something wrong when I haven't. You're treating me like I'm a threat when I'm just trying to get home. Why?" Jenkins opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The truth was that he didn't know why he had kept going. He had stopped her in the first place just because she was black. He didn't have an answer. The only reason he could give would reveal the ugly truth he was trying so hard to ignore. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he tried to block out the feeling of shame and anger. Renee took a step closer, her gaze focused straight at his eyes. "Officer," she said softly, "you need to think very carefully about what you're doing right now." Jenkins stared at her. He had cut more than he could handle, and his breath was coming in short, shallow bursts. Renee had not threatened him, but he could tell that her words carried a weight that he couldn't ignore. There was something about her, something in the way she spoke, the way she carried herself, that made him feel like he was the one under scrutiny, like she was watching him, judging him, and he was coming up short. "I suggest you finish checking my information and let me go," Renee continued, "before you make this worse than it already is." Jenkins's throat tightened, his hands trembling slightly. He knew she was right. He knew he should just let her go, apologize even. But his pride was going to be the death of him. Letting her go at this point will be conceding defeat to a black woman. How could he live with himself after that, he thought to himself. She had to be up to something or had done something wrong, and he was going to prove it. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered again. But the words felt weak, even to him. He hated how it sounded like an excuse rather than a reason. Renee didn't respond again. She looked him dead in the eye, willing him to do his worst. Jenkins took a slow, shaky breath, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had no reason to keep this going, no justification for the way he'd treated her. But admitting that, letting her walk away, felt like a loss, like he was giving up some part of his authority. But then, deep down, he knew that the longer he dragged this out, the worse it was going to get. The night was getting darker now. The sun was starting to descend below the horizon as the last traces of daylight faded. Streetlights were starting to cast long shadows across the street. The quiet suburban neighborhood lay undisturbed, oblivious to what was going on between Officer Jenkins and Renee. Jenkins's fingers drummed nervously against the side of his holster as he stood in front of her car, struggling with the growing realization that he was going out of his depth. But at the same time, he couldn't back down now. He'd pulled her over for no reason, made a big deal out of nothing, and now he had no other option but to see it through. But Renee wasn't even trying to give him any easy way out. The way she handled the situation, her calmness and steady gaze, made him feel cornered. Jenkins' radio crackled faintly on his shoulder. His heart skipped a beat. He couldn't take the call, not now. The last thing he wanted was more eyes on this situation. He had to maintain control of the stop, of her, and most of all, of himself. Renee stood beside her car, watching Jenkins with a quiet intensity. She was still not nervous or showing any signs of discomfort. This was a first time for Jenkins. He had expected her calmness to have worn off by now, but if anything, she seemed to be even more calm now. Her composure was throwing him off, and he didn't know what to make of it. The silence was heavy in the air. Renee's gaze never left him, but she was still not playing the role he wanted her to. She didn't grovel, didn't get defensive, didn't try to apologize or defend herself. Instead, she stood tall, arms relaxed by her sides, with her eyes calm and ready for wherever was coming. At this point, the silence was suffocating for Jenkins. Jenkins broke out in a sweat. He needed to break this silence, to take control of the situation before it got any worse. "You need to step over here," Jenkins ordered, his voice cold as he motioned toward the sidewalk, further away from the car. His heart pounded in his chest, knowing full well he had no legitimate reason to ask her to step further away from her car. But his instincts told him to push harder, to keep pressing her until something gave. Renee raised an eyebrow, her face and eye betraying nothing. She couldn't determine if Officer Jenkins was just determined to frustrate her or unintentionally racially profiling her. "I'm already outside of the car, officer. Why do I need to move further?" Jenkins's throat tightened. There it was again, that calm, almost clinical tone, as if she were the one in control. It set him on edge. "Just do as I say," he snapped, trying to mask his unease with authority. "Step over here." Renee didn't move. She just stood there, staring at him. Her eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite read. Disappointment, maybe. Then, without a word, she stepped onto the sidewalk, positioning herself exactly where Jenkins had indicated. But her calm composure didn't waver. If anything, it seemed like she was even more determined, like she was playing a long game that he wasn't even aware of. "Is there something specific you're looking for, officer?" Renee asked. Jenkins shifted his weight from one foot to the other as he desperately tried to hide the growing sense of panic that even he couldn't pretend wasn't there anymore. He was losing control, and he knew it. He had nothing on her, no reason to be dragging this out, but admitting that now felt impossible. He had already gone too far. "I need to search the car," Jenkins said suddenly, the words spilling out before he had time to actually think about it. Renee's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time since he stopped her, Jenkins saw the frustration in her eyes. But even then, it was obvious she was still in control. "Search the car? On what grounds?" Jenkins clenched his jaw, refusing to back down. He couldn't back down now. "I have reason to believe..." "With all due respect, officer," Renee interrupted. Her voice wasn't calm anymore. There was a coldness to it. "You have no reason to search my car. You've seen my license and registration. Everything checks out. I've complied with every order you've given. So, unless you can give me a valid reason, you're not searching my vehicle." Jenkins couldn't believe what he had just heard. Did this black woman just dare say no to him? He could feel the frustration bubbling up as his hand hovered near his holster, more out of instinct than necessity. Throughout his career in the police force, nobody had ever said no to him, more so coming from a black woman. But there was something about this woman, her defiant stance, and her piercing gaze. For a brief moment, Jenkins considered calling for backup, but the thought vanished as quickly as it had come. What would he say? That he'd pulled over a woman for no reason, and now she wasn't letting him search her car? He could imagine the raised eyebrows, the questions, and the outcome that would come from it. No, he had to handle this himself. "I don't need your permission to search your car," Jenkins said, his voice tight, though the uncertainty in his tone betrayed him. Renee's eyes narrowed and she took a step closer. "Actually, you do," she said quietly. "Unless you've got probable cause, officer, you're overstepping your authority. I know my rights." The words hit Jenkins like a punch to the gut. He hated hearing that phrase. "I know my rights." It was always a red flag, a signal that the person he was dealing with wasn't going to just roll over and accept whatever he threw at them. Hearing it from Renee was the last straw to break the camel's back. "You need to watch your tone," Jenkins shot back, his voice rising as he pointed a finger at her. "You're starting to sound real uncooperative, and that's not going to help you here. Trust me, you don't want to know what I'm capable of." Renee let out a slow breath. She was shocked and frustrated, but she wasn't going to fall for his bait. "I'm not being uncooperative, officer. I've complied with everything you've asked. I've shown you my documents. I've answered your questions. But I won't let you violate my rights." Jenkins's face flushed with anger. Her calm defiance felt like a personal insult, like she was mocking him in some way. He couldn't let this go. Damn the consequences. He was going to show this woman who the boss was. "You think you can tell me how to do my job?" Jenkins snapped, his voice growing louder. "You think you can stand here and talk back to me like that?" Renee's jaw tightened, but she didn't raise her voice. "I'm not telling you how to do your job. I'm telling you to do it within the bounds of the law." Jenkins's eye twitched in anger as his hands started to tremble with barely contained anger. He couldn't believe this was happening. He was supposed to be in control, the one giving orders, not taking them. But Renee wasn't playing the role he wanted her to. "You're walking a fine line, Ms. Thompson," Jenkins warned, though his voice was starting to tremble with the weight of his own frustration. "Keep pushing, and I'll have you in cuffs before you know it." Renee's eyes flashed with something fierce, but her voice remained level. "Is that a threat, officer?" Jenkins was caught off guard by the question, his mind racing as he tried to find his footing again. "I'm telling you to cooperate, or there will be consequences." Renee took another step forward, her voice low and firm. "I've been cooperating. You're the one crossing the line, not me." For the first time, Jenkins saw something in her eyes. There was something about this woman he had not noticed earlier. It wasn't just about the way she carried herself. It was like he was standing on the edge of something much bigger than this traffic stop. He wasn't sure how to handle it. "Officer," Renee said softly, "you need to step back and think carefully about what you're doing right now." Jenkins's throat tightened. The words rang in his ears, cutting through the haze of anger and frustration that had clouded his judgment. He didn't know what to do next. He had no reason to search her car, no reason to keep her here. But admitting that felt like giving up, like letting her win. And he couldn't let that happen, no matter what. The air between Officer Jenkins and Renee was thick with tension. Jenkins stood stiffly with his arms crossed, feeling the weight of his own words echoing in his head. He knew he was walking a thin line, and for the first time, a sliver of doubt was starting to worm its way into his mind. But his frustration and pride wouldn't let him stop. He had to have control. Renee stood in front of him. Her body language was still steady and composed, but Jenkins could see the cracks in her composure, the tiny vein popping in her forehead, the slight narrowing of her eyes. He could tell she was frustrated, but despite her annoyance, Renee was trying her best to remain calm. She could tell that her calm composure and demeanor were slowly getting to Officer Jenkins. He was a man who consistently had to be in control, and taking that away from him was the best play for her. It made him feel like she was looking right through him, like she could see every insecurity, every crack in his authority, and how small he truly was. She spoke softly, but there was a firmness in her tone that Jenkins couldn't ignore. "Officer, what exactly are you accusing me of?" Jenkins felt the breath catch in his throat. "I never said I was accusing you of anything." "But you're treating me like a suspect," Renee replied. "You want to search my car. You're threatening to put me in cuffs. If that's not treating me like a suspect, then what is it?" Jenkins opened his mouth to respond, but the words got tangled up somewhere between his brain and his throat. He was used to people backing down, used to them getting defensive, explaining themselves away, trying to make things easier on themselves. But not Renee. She was different. She was standing her ground, and it was driving him mad. Jenkins clenched his fists at his sides, digging his finger into his palms. "I don't need to explain myself to you." "You do, actually," Renee said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Because if you're going to search my car, you need a reason, and so far you haven't given me one." Jenkins hated how logical she sounded, and hated that everything she said somehow made sense. But he couldn't let her think she had the upper hand in this. He was the officer. He was the one in control. And she had better act like it, or he would make sure she spent a night in the cell. "I've got a perfectly good reason," Jenkins muttered. His mind scrambled for something, anything, that could justify what he was doing. Renee raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. "Oh? And what reason is that, officer?" Jenkins felt his throat tighten. He had nothing except the uncomfortable truth he was refusing to acknowledge, that he had pulled her over because she was black, and he didn't believe she could afford to live in such a neighborhood that her calm confidence made him feel out of control. But he couldn't admit that. Not to her, and definitely not to himself, because what would that make him? "I don't have to explain myself to you," Jenkins repeated, his voice sharper now. "You're acting suspicious, and I need to make sure you're not a threat." "A threat?" Renee repeated. "Exactly what kind of threat do you think I am?" Jenkins felt the heat rising in his face. "You're being uncooperative. You're asking too many questions, and you were driving slowly through a very affluent neighborhood that you obviously don't belong in. That's suspicious behavior." Renee shook her head slowly, a small, bitter smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. "Officer, are you racially profiling me right now?" Renee asked. "What? How?" Jenkins stammered. "This has nothing to do with your race," he replied. Renee's words had suddenly made him uncomfortable because she had hit the jackpot. He knew she was right, but he just couldn't admit it. "You're not helping yourself," Jenkins snapped, his voice rising. He took a step closer to her, trying to close the distance. "You think you can just talk your way out of this?" Renee met his gaze squarely. "I don't need to talk my way out of anything. You've got nothing on me, and you know it." Jenkins's pulse quickened. The way she said it, the certainty in her voice. What did she know that he didn't? It made him feel like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. "Let me be clear," Renee said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You're overstepping your authority. I know my rights, and I'm not going to let you violate them just because you're uncomfortable with how I look, the neighborhood I'm in, or the fact that your ego is bruised that I'm not groveling at your feet." Jenkins's heart pounded in his chest. He felt like he was losing control of the situation, like the power was slipping from his grasp, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He could hear his breath coming quicker and see his hands shaking just slightly as he tried to hold on to whatever authority he had left. "You're acting like you're above the law," Jenkins snapped. "You think just because you're calm, I'll let you go." Renee's eyes narrowed, but she didn't raise her voice. "I don't think I'm above the law, officer. I think you're supposed to uphold it. And right now, you're not." Her words were tearing down the fragile barrier Jenkins had built around himself. The only reason holding him back from putting her in cuffs and dragging her back to the station was that he had yet to find a reasonable motive for the arrest. At this point, it could be anything minor. He didn't care. He could feel the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. What was he doing? Why was he pushing so hard? Jenkins took a shaky breath, trying to get himself under control. He needed to find a way to end this. But how? He had taken things too far. Backing down now would mean admitting that he had been wrong in the first place. Renee watched him, her eyes calm and steady, waiting for him to make the next move. Jenkins's radio crackled again, and he flinched, the sound jolting him back to reality. His hand hovered over his radio, but he didn't answer. He already knew how the situation would look if he called it in. It would get out of hand fast. He could already imagine the questions and the looks from his fellow officers. He couldn't let that happen. Renee took a slow step forward. "Officer, this is your chance to stop. Right now. You can step back, check my information, and let me go. Or you can keep digging yourself into a hole. It's your choice." Her words hit Jenkins like a punch. He hated that she was right. But more than anything, he hated the small voice in the back of his mind, the one whispering that she was giving him a way out, that he should take it. Jenkins's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his mind racing. He didn't want to back down, but the longer this went on, the more dangerous it became. He could feel it like a noose tightening around his neck. "You need to stop talking," Jenkins muttered, even though he could hear the weakness in his voice. Renee didn't respond. She just looked at him, her silence more powerful than any words she could have spoken. Jenkins felt the weight of her gaze, the weight of the entire situation pressing down on him. He had started this. He had escalated it. And now, he was stuck. But there was no way out. "I'll say it one more time," Renee said quietly, her voice firm. "Let me go. Before you make this worse." Jenkins stared at her, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. He knew what he should do. But admitting he had been wrong, letting her go now, it felt like admitting defeat. It felt like giving up everything he had worked for, everything he believed about his authority. But deep down, he knew she was right. He had no reason to keep her here. Officer Jenkins stared at Renee, his mind racing. How had he ended up here? His heart was pounding against his chest, frustration and uncertainty coiling tight inside him, fighting to burst. Renee was standing a few feet away from him, still as a statue, her eyes pinned to his unyieldingly. That calmness, that shocking cold calmness, was what was driving him over the edge. "You're really not getting it, are you?" Jenkins growled, his voice very close to a snarl at this point. Renee only raised her eyebrow. She didn't have to say a word because her silence spoke volumes, and it made Jenkins even more annoyed. How could she be so cool when he had tried everything in his books? He had tried intimidation, threats, and even insults. But it was like she was impervious to whatever he was saying. Every moment that seemed to pass made him feel like less than in front of this small black woman, his power slipping from his grasp. "You think this is a game?" Jenkins went on, raising his voice. "You think you can just stand here and act like you're untouchable?" Renee's head tilted as she met his eyes, now edged with a trace of frustration. "Officer, I've told you. I've complied with every single thing you've asked. You're the one dragging this out, not me." Jenkins' stomach twisted. She was right, and he knew it. But admitting that he had been wrong from the start, felt like a blow to his pride. He couldn't just let this go now, not after all the orders, the threats, the escalating tension. He'd crossed the line a while back, and now he was stuck. There was no going back. "You think I don't know what's going on here?" Jenkins snapped, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I see people like you all of the time. You are all the same and never up to any good. You loot houses, steal cars, and lie. Military officer? Then I'm the President of the United States," Jenkins said, insinuating that Renee had been lying about being a military worker. Renee's expression didn't change, but Jenkins could see her jaw tighten. "People like me?" she repeated. Jenkins paused for a moment, but this growing frustration urged him forward. "Yeah, people like you. You think you're smart, but I'm not falling for it." Renee took a deep breath and spoke, her tone suddenly sharper. "Officer, do you even hear yourself? What exactly are you insinuating? That I lied about being a military worker? You don't think a black woman can be part of the military? I followed your every request. Which part of this do you find suspicious?" Jenkins' mouth opened to say something, but nothing came out. He had no answer. His mind was trying to find anything that might get him off the hook, but there was nothing. He had only the growing sense that he had overstepped in every conceivable way, and now he was trapped. "You're just trying to make this harder on yourself," Jenkins said, though to his ears the words sounded weak, desperate. Renee slowly shook her head. Jenkins could see the disappointment in her eyes as she spoke. "No, officer. You're the one making this hard. You pulled me over for no reason. You escalated this for no reason, and now you're threatening to arrest me. For what? For standing here and defending myself?" "I'm not going to ask again," Jenkins said, his voice trembling. "You need to start cooperating." Renee's eyes narrowed, her composure giving way to something more tough. "I've been cooperating, officer, but I won't let you intimidate me into giving up my rights. You're wrong, and you know it." For a moment, Jenkins almost reached for his cuffs. Damn the consequences. He was willing to let the anger boiling inside him take over. But something stopped him. Renee took another step closer. "You need to think very carefully about what you do next." Jenkins swallowed hard, his hands shaking at his sides. He didn't know what to do. "You're playing a dangerous game," Jenkins said. Renee didn't bat an eye. "No, officer. It is you who are playing the dangerous game. And it is not going to play well for you if you keep pushing." Jenkins felt his pulse increase, the weight of her words settling upon him like a vice. "I could arrest you right now." Renee's eyes flashed with that strong edge of defiance he had seen before. "For what?" she replied. Jenkins blinked. He had not expected her to reply so quickly. For obstruction. For being uncooperative," he stammered. Renee shook her head slowly, a grim smile tugging at her lips. "Obstruction? Uncooperative? Officer, I've been nothing but cooperative, and you know it." She had agreed to every demand. She'd given him license and registration, stood outside the car when ordered, and answered all his questions. She'd done nothing wrong, and yet here he was, threatening arrest for what? For standing up for herself? Renee took a deep breath in, and her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Look, I know what this is about. You're in too deep, and now you don't know how to get out of it without losing face. But you need to stop, officer. Right now." Jenkins's chest heaved up and down as his breath came in quick burps. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, balancing at the cusp of a decision that would change everything. He could keep pushing and trying to force this into a situation that it wasn't, or step back and admit he was wrong and let her go. But the fear of losing control, of admitting defeat, held him frozen in place. "You're going to regret this," Jenkins muttered, though the words felt hollow, even to him. "No, officer. You're the one who's going to regret it," Renee replied. Jenkins could feel his anger rising in him, but it was mixed with something else, something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't exactly fear, but it was close. It was the sinking realization that he had lost control of the situation long ago, and now there was no easy way out. Renee took a deep breath as she dipped her hand into her pocket, pulling out a shiny bronze ID. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm an Army colonel, officer." It was like the words hit Jenkins right in the chest. The world seemed to slow down, and for a minute, he was speechless, just staring at her as his mind scrambled to catch up with what had just come out of her mouth. "What?" he croaked, his voice cracking. "I'm an Army colonel," Renee said again, her eyes focused on his. "And you've just made the biggest mistake of your career." Jenkins couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had yelled at her, bullied her, threatened her. And she was a colonel? His mind couldn't make sense of what was going on. She wasn't a civilian, and she had taken everything he had thrown at her with so much grace. That explained everything. The calmness, the confidence, and her composure. She was somebody with rank, with authority. Why had he not thought about that? You're... Jenkins was stammering, his voice barely above a whisper. Renee didn't move or blink. "I suggest you think very carefully about what you do next, officer." In that second, Jenkins's heart was beating so loudly he thought she could hear it. The full weight of the action he had just displayed was crashing down all at once. His arrogance, his pride, his prejudice. It all had brought him here to this moment. And now he could not believe the mess he had made. How did his boring shift come to an end with him arresting an Army colonel? Jenkins knew he had crossed the line. There was no going back now. For a long moment, Officer Jenkins stared at Renee, his head ringing with the words over and over in his mind. Army colonel. The thought of it all was just unbelievable for him. This woman standing before him, whom he had yelled at, threatened, and treated like some suspect for no reason at all, was an Army colonel. It all started to make sense. She had mentioned earlier that she was military, but he didn't believe her. He thought she was lying to escape being questioned. What Jenkins couldn't understand was why she had tolerated everything he had done when she could have pulled that ID at any point. Was she testing him? As he looked at her, it was apparent that she had expected this moment to happen all along. Jenkins swallowed forcefully, forcing the words to come out. You're a colonel?" "Yes," Renee said curtly, her eyes not leaving his. "And I have been more than patient with you, officer. I gave you several opportunities to stop and end this." Jenkins felt as if his heart was hammering inside his chest. He could feel the blood racing to his face, a flush so hot and cold at once. His mind told him to say something, to do anything to salvage the situation, but all he could do was stand there dumbfounded. "She's an Army colonel," Jenkins muttered to himself again. His chest began to bubble with panic as he realized how much trouble he was in. He knew he had pushed Renee too far, only to find out that this was a woman who could end his career in the blink of an eye. The universe had a twisted sense of humor, Jenkins thought to himself. "Colonel Thompson?" Jenkins stammered, looking at the gold ID she had provided as if he needed proof this was actually happening. Renee's face didn't betray whatever she was feeling. Jenkins knew she must be satisfied. He knew he would be if roles were reversed. Yes, I tried to tell you that before, but you weren't exactly listening. Jenkins's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His mind was racing, but it was as if his thoughts were knotted together, and he could not make any audible word that made sense. As Jenkins stood by the roadside, he could already sense the shitstorm coming. Jenkins started, but the words stuck in his throat. That confidence and authority he had desperately clung to was gone now. He felt naked, exposed in a way that he never had before. This wasn't just some mundane traffic stop gone wrong. It was his career on the line. Renee watched him closely. "You know, officer," she said quietly, "this could have gone very differently, but you let your arrogance and your bias get in the way." Jenkins swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He wanted to try to explain himself, but he knew she was right. Every decision he'd made since the moment he saw her car had been colored by his bias, assumptions he hadn't even realized he'd been making. Jenkins's voice cracked, and he cleared his throat quickly. "Why didn't you tell me you were an Army colonel? I didn't know." Renee's eyes didn't blink. "And to what end will that be? I already mentioned that I worked with the military, but you disregarded me. Would you have acted differently if I had told you I was an Army colonel the moment you pulled me over?" Jenkins' stomach twisted. She had him cornered, and he knew it. If he admitted that knowing her rank would have changed his behavior, it would have been as good as admitting that her treatment had been rooted in bias, not in the law. But if he said it wouldn't have changed anything, he'd be lying to both of them. Jenkins said, trailing off as he couldn't find a response that wouldn't make the situation worse. Renee took another slow step forward, her eyes slightly narrowing. "Let me make one thing clear to you, officer. I've spent my entire career serving this country. I've commanded soldiers and been in situations far more uncomfortable than this. But today, you treated me like a common criminal. All for what? Because you believe a black woman could not afford to live in this wealthy neighborhood?" The blood drained from Jenkins's face as the weight of her words came crashing down on him. It was obvious she wasn't angry, just disappointed, and somehow that made everything worse. You have to understand I didn't." Jenkins stuttered, grasping for any excuse or justification that would explain his actions. Renee's eyes flashed hot with anger. "You didn't what? Didn't think I belonged here? Didn't think someone like me could be driving through this neighborhood without it being suspicious?" The air just seemed to get sucked from his lungs. He had nothing in response. Nothing that could explain the blatant truth in her words. He had jumped to a conclusion because of his bias and racial discrimination, and now it was going to cost him. "I'm sorry," Jenkins murmured, the words tumbling from his mouth before he could think of anything better to say. Renee raised one eyebrow at his pathetic attempt at an apology. "Sorry? I didn't mean for it to go this far," Jenkins stuttered, his voice shaking. "You thought what?" Renee snapped out. "That I was some kind of threat? That I was dangerous?" Jenkins swallowed hard, his throat tight. He could not bring himself to look her in the eye anymore. I made a mistake." Renee took another step forward, her voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "A mistake? Officer, this wasn't just a mistake. The way you acted today showed that this was not the first time. It's more of a pattern of behavior that officers like you pull out whenever you encounter people like me. And you know it." Jenkins winced at the truth in her words. She was right. This wasn't just about this one traffic stop. It was about all those other times he had assumed things, about all those other people who had to endure this type of treatment. All the while, he'd been telling himself he was doing his job, keeping the peace. Now, however, as he stood before Renee, he realized that from the beginning, he had always been part of the problem. "I'm really sorry," Jenkins said again, his voice now barely more than a whisper. Renee stared at him a long time, her eyes cold. "Sorry isn't enough." Jenkins felt the lump in his throat. He had never felt so small, so powerless. Everything he had ever built his identity on, his authority, his control, had crumbled in the face of this one mistake. I didn't know," Jenkins said, his voice weak, barely above a whisper. Renee exhaled slowly as she shook her head. "You still don't get it, do you?" she replied. "It shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter if I'm a colonel, a teacher, or a cashier at the grocery store. You should treat everyone with respect, officer. But you didn't. You didn't even give me a chance." She was right. He hadn't given her a chance. He had seen, judged, and then acted upon it without the slightest feeling that he was wrong. And now he stood in the wreckage of his actions, completely lost on how to fix it, or if it was something that could be fixed. "I'll do anything to make it right," Jenkins said, his voice shaking. "Please." Renee's eyes flashed, and for one instant Jenkins thought she might snap at him, tear him to shreds for everything he had done. But instead, she took a slow breath and shook her head. "It's not about making it right for me," she said quietly. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen again to me or anyone else." Jenkins nodded rapidly, his heart beating loudly. "I understand. I'll make sure it doesn't." He could feel her piercing gaze, but he could tell she didn't believe him. "And can you blame her?" he thought to himself. "You better. Because I will be filing a formal complaint. And trust me when I say this won't end well for you if it happens again." Jenkins's heart skipped a beat at what he had just heard. He had to dig into his palms to keep himself from falling over in shame. A formal complaint was the last thing he needed right now. His career, his good name, it could all come crashing down because of this. But there was nothing he could say, nothing he could do to change it now. "I understand," Jenkins said weakly, his voice barely audible. She gave him one last look, the expression on her face a mix of disappointment and frustration as she turned and walked back to her car. She opened the door, paused for a second, then turned back to look at him. "Next time, think before you act," Renee said, cool but firm. "You might just save yourself a lot of trouble." With that, she got into her car, closed the door, and drove away, leaving Officer Jenkins standing on the sidewalk, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him like a lead blanket. As her taillights disappeared into the distance, Jenkins stood there, frozen, the cold realization of what he had done settling deep in his bones. He had crossed the line. And now, there was no going back. Officer Jenkins stood on the side of the road, staring at the spot where Renee's car had disappeared down the street. The quiet hum of the evening settled back in, but inside his mind, everything was chaos. He had messed up big time. His hands were still trembling from Renee's confession. The weight of what had just transpired weighed heavily on him, and the more he thought about it, he couldn't see any way to remedy the situation. He wished there was a way he could take it all back. He would not have stopped Renee at all. He would have clocked out of his shift and on his way home by now. How had he let things spiral out of control like this? He asked himself, trying to make sense of it all. Jenkins exhaled shakily, his hand instinctively going to his radio. For a second, he thought about calling it in, telling his superior he had just pulled over an Army colonel, that things had gotten out of hand, and maybe, just maybe, he'd be able to make the incident sound less bad than it really was. But as his fingers hovered over the button, he stopped himself. What was he even going to say? That he had taken what should have been a routine traffic stop and turned it into a big deal because of his bias and ego? That he had yelled at a high-ranking military officer for no good reason? That he had let his prejudices blind him so thoroughly that he hadn't even recognized who he was dealing with? No. He couldn't radio it in. The damage had been done, and all he could do was pick up the pieces. Jenkins swallowed hard as he dropped his hand from the radio, his mind racing. He could already imagine how bad this could be if Renee actually went through with filing the complaint. Renee had said she was going to file a formal complaint, and Jenkins had absolutely no doubt that she meant it. He could already see how everything would play out. The cold stare of his supervisor as he desperately tried to explain himself, the pages of paperwork, and the awkward silence from his colleagues when they realized just how badly he had screwed up. He could lose his job over this, he thought to himself. Reality was starting to hit, and Jenkins' heart began pounding rapidly in his chest. His job was the one thing he knew he was good at. If he lost it, he didn't know who he would be. His job was the one thing that gave him purpose, that gave him control, that made him feel like he was somebody, and that he belonged. The thought that it could be taken away because of one horrible decision, one wrong moment, made his blood boil with anger. But it was anger towards himself. Jenkins couldn't help but think of Renee's revelation. "I'm an Army colonel." Her words replayed in his head as they had so many times already. He just could not clear it from his conscience. The look in her eyes, tone of her voice, calm and steady, even when he was at his worst, screaming, ordering her around, threatening her. She'd stood there and taken it all with grace, not because she was weak, but because she knew precisely what kind of power she held, and he had been utterly blind to it. Jenkins screwed his eyes shut, rubbing a hand over his face. He'd prided himself on being in control, on knowing how to handle any situation, but in the heat of the moment, he'd let his insecurities and prejudices get the better of him. He hadn't seen her race before he saw her as a person. He'd seen her as an obstacle to his path, a problem to be solved, a threat to his authority. And now, he was paying the price. The cold evening air had turned his fingers purple with cold. Jenkins realized he hadn't moved from his spot on the sidewalk. He looked around, hoping nobody had witnessed the encounter, but the neighborhood was still quiet, with only the noise of crickets breaking the silence. Jenkins felt sick. His stomach twisted as the full weight of what he had done settled in. This was no longer just about him. He'd disrespected a woman who had given her entire career to serving her country, someone who most likely had faced far more troubles than he could even start to imagine. And he'd treated her like a criminal. Even worse, he had acted like she wasn't worthy of the same respect given to anyone else. Because deep down in his heart, he hadn't thought she belonged. Jenkins clenched his fists at his sides as the guilt welled up in his throat like bile. He couldn't deny it anymore. He had allowed his bias and ego to rule his actions. He saw a black woman driving through an affluent, quiet suburban neighborhood and just assumed the worst. And now, there was no going back. He could remember her face, how she had remained calm and composed, even when he'd turned aggressive and resorted to subtle threats. He remembered how she'd let him know that with an even voice, she was a colonel. As if it was a secret, she didn't want anyone to know. Renee had given him every opportunity to step back and assess his actions, but he hadn't listened. Pride and his bias had driven him straight into this disaster. "I'm sorry," Jenkins muttered to himself, the words falling flat against the open air. But sorry wasn't enough. Not anymore. He looked at the pavement as his mind raced. He could still hear his voice, loud and angry, shouting at her to step out of the car, threatening her with arrest. His stomach churned at the very image of himself in that moment. How had he become this? When had his job turned him into someone who saw threats where there were none, who needed to dominate every situation? He used to believe he was one of the good guys. He wore the badge to protect people, to uphold the law, and to keep the peace. Now, standing alone in the dark, he wasn't so sure any longer. Jenkins ran a hand through his hair, trying to soothe the storm of thoughts racing through his mind. What now? How could he fix this? Was it even possible to fix the mess he had made? The truth was that he couldn't. Not really. The damage was done. And Renee was right. This wasn't just about her. This was about everyone he had ever treated like a suspect for no reason. Every person who had been on the receiving end of his unchecked authority. He had been blind to it before, but now it stared him right in the face. Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. He had to try something, anything. He could try and apologize, attempt to make amends somehow. However, that wouldn't change what happened. His actions had spoken louder than any words he could say now. He had shown his colors, and now he had to live with the consequences of his actions. He remembered what Renee had said as she drove away. "It's not about making it right for me. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again." Those were words that continued to echo in his mind, and for the first time, Jenkins understood what she meant. It was not about saving his career or saving face. It was not even about making amends with her. It was about changing. And the first step was acknowledging that you had a problem and doing something about it. He couldn't just walk away from this and really pretend it never happened. He needed to confront this reality of who he became and make sure not to travel this road once more. Jenkins let out a deep sigh. He knew what was next: the formal complaint, the disciplinary action, the meetings with his superiors. But maybe, just maybe, it was the wake-up call he needed. Because if he didn't change, if he didn't stand and fight whatever it was inside him, he would lose so much more than a job. He would lose himself. Jenkins stood on the sidewalk a little bit more. He could hardly feel his fingers now. He turned and began walking back at a slow pace to his patrol car, every step feeling heavier than the last. He had no idea what would follow next. Just one thing was for sure. He couldn't just return to the status quo. The door closed behind him as he slid into the driver's seat, his gaze hard and long on the steering wheel. Man, had he blown it? But maybe he could learn from it if he was willing to face the truth. The drive back to the precinct was painfully slow. Officer Jenkins's knuckles were white as snow as his patrol car rolled through the now empty streets. His mind kept replaying the scene with Renee over and over, each memory more unbearable than the last. The quiet of the night only made the voices in his head worse. Jenkins could not withstand the deep feeling of regret that washed over him. Jenkins couldn't shake the feeling of dread settling deep in his stomach. He was supposed to be the one in control, the one with authority, but now he felt completely empty and powerless. The power dynamics had shifted, not just between him and Renee, but within himself. Everything he'd thought he knew about his job, about himself as a cop, had been put into question tonight. Jenkins parked his car in the lot behind the station. As he sat there for a second, with his motor still running, his mind drifted back to the incident. The familiar glow of the precinct lights washed over the area in that dull, fluorescent haze. He used to feel happy when he drove into this parking lot. It was like he was part of something bigger and important. Now, as he sat staring at the lights that washed over the precinct, he felt like a fraud. He was part of everything that was wrong with the police department. He turned the engine off and slumped back in his seat, his eyes fixed on the blackened windshield. His mind kept drifting back to Renee's words. "You didn't even give me a chance." It was a line that stuck with him. He hadn't given her a chance, hadn't seen her for who she really was, for who anyone might be when they're stopped by an officer. He had viewed her as an issue to be controlled, a risk because of the color of her skin. And only then, when he came to find out she was an Army colonel, did it all change. He could hardly stand himself for it. It was a knock on his car window that made him jump. Jenkins blinked, straightening up as the fog of his thoughts cleared. It was Officer Kelly, one of his colleagues, leaning against the side of the car, peering through the window. "Hey, Jenkins. You good, man? You've been out here for a while." Jenkins nodded then, forcing a smile. Yeah, just thinking." Kelly raised an eyebrow but didn't push it. "All right, well, get in there. Shift's almost over." Jenkins murmured a response to him and got out of the car, the cold night air stinging his skin as he stepped onto the pavement. Kelly gave him a curious look, but said nothing as they went inside together. The fluorescent lights inside the precinct were harsh, too bright after the dimness of the night. The moment he walked in, Jenkins saw his supervisor, Sergeant Davis, standing toward the back, talking with a couple of other officers. The second Davis saw him, he waved him over. His expression was blank, so Jenkins couldn't tell if Renee had made the report. He felt a fresh wave of nerves roll through him as he made his way over. "Jenkins, got a minute?" Davis asked, his tone casual, but with an edge that made Jenkins's heart pound faster. "Yeah, sure," Jenkins said, though even his voice sounded distant to himself, like someone else's. Davis led him into a little side office, the door softly clicking shut behind them. Jenkins felt like the walls in the room were closing in on him. Davis sat opposite him, leaning back in his chair, scanning Jenkins with his eyes as though he was trying to read from the thoughts racing within his head. "What's up with you tonight?" Davis asked after a moment, his voice neutral, but Jenkins could tell he was probing. How much did he know, he wondered. Jenkins swallowed hard. He could feel the weight of the evening weighing down on him, the gravity of what he had done weighing down on him. "I had an incident on a stop tonight," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. Davis raised an eyebrow. "What kind of incident?" Jenkins brushed off the urge to try to brush off what happened as a small incident. He could make this sound less serious than it was. He could spin it, smooth over the rough edges, and make it seem like just another routine encounter that got a little heated. But even as the thoughts crossed his mind, he knew they weren't right. He couldn't do that. So he told the truth. "I pulled someone over tonight," Jenkins said, voice shaking. "A black woman. She wasn't doing anything wrong. I pulled her over because I thought she looked suspicious." Davis frowned slightly but didn't interrupt. Jenkins pressed on, his throat clutching with every word. "I escalated it. I treated her like she was a threat, even though she wasn't. And then she told me she was an Army colonel. And that's when I realized how badly I'd messed up." Davis's expression darkened and he leaned forward slightly, narrowing his eyes. "An Army colonel?" Jenkins nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "Yeah, she said she's lodging a formal complaint. And frankly, I don't blame her. I crossed the line." Davis leaned back in his chair, stroking his jaw as he thought about what Jenkins had told him. Minutes passed into what seemed like an eternity of silence. Every second that passed made the tension even heavier. Jenkins dug his fingers into his palms to distract him. He felt like he was standing on the edge of the cliff, waiting for Davis to push him off. Finally, Davis spoke. His voice was low, but it was firm. "You're telling me you stopped her for no reason, escalated things, and only after treating her like a suspect, it came to you who she was?" Jenkins nodded, feeling his stomach churning with regret. "Yes, sir." Davis exhaled slowly and shook his head. "Jenkins, you do know this one is going to backfire, and I don't think the department will be able to protect you if she files a formal complaint. The department will be forced to investigate. You're going to come under a lot of scrutiny." Jenkins swallowed hard as he slowly tried to calm himself from panicking. He knew it was coming, but now that his supervisor confirmed it, it sounded a little more like a death sentence. Under scrutiny, the words echoed in his head. His career was hanging in the balance now, and he knew he couldn't do anything to wriggle out of this one. "I know," said Jenkins in hushed tones, hardly above a whisper. "I deserve it." Davis leaned forward again, his eyes locking onto Jenkins's. "Look, Jenkins, we've all made mistakes on the job, but this is big. You've got to own up to it. You've got to face the consequences, and you've got to learn from it." Jenkins nodded slowly, though his mind was still swirling with everything that had happened. "I will," he said, though the words felt hollow. "I'll take responsibility." Davis watched him for some time before finally leaning back. "All right. I'm going to have to report this, you know that. But if you're serious about owning up to it, you need to get ahead of this. Try to write a formal apology. Make it right with her, however you can." The thought of having to face Renee again formed a lump in Jenkins's throat. How could he make this right? How could any apology right the wrongs he had committed? But Davis was right. He couldn't hide from this. He had to face it head on, even though the very thought made him terrified beyond anything else. "I'll do it," Jenkins said with a barely steady voice. "I'll apologize." Davis nodded slightly, his face softening a little. "Good. Now go home. You've got a long few days ahead of you." Slowly, Jenkins heaved his body up, weighed down by exhaustion. It was when he left the office and made his way out of the precinct that he finally exhaled deeply. He knew there were consequences to be faced, and it started now with facing Renee. Jenkins took a long breath as he stepped out into the cold night air. The balance of power had shifted, and there was just no getting around it anymore. And for the first time, Jenkins realized that he was never meant to be in control all along. The next morning, Officer Jenkins woke up with a heavy pit in his stomach. He had been finding it difficult to sleep, haunted by the memory of Renee's calm but sharp words. He still woke up, hoping it had all been a bad dream. The whole situation weighed heavy, like a boulder in his chest. He stared at the ceiling for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. Today was going to be one of the hardest days of his career. The formal complaint was coming. That much was certain. But more than that, Jenkins knew he couldn't let this go without trying to make it right. He didn't know if an apology would be enough, but he had to try. He forced himself out of the bed as he wore his uniform and badge. As he put each of them on, he couldn't help but wonder if he was worthy. The mirror showed a man who had lost the confidence he used to have in the role. He was not looking at an officer in control, but one who had lost his way. As he stepped out of his apartment, Jenkins' mind was buzzing with different scenarios of how the day would turn out. His hands clung more than usual to the cold steering wheel as he drove to the precinct. He wasn't ready to face this, but there was no other option. When he drove into the precinct, everything seemed to be off. He felt as if everything around him was louder. The hum of conversations, an officer speaking to his dispatch equipment, and the creaking office chairs. Maybe it was just his nerves amplifying everything around him. As he walked inside, Jenkins could feel everyone's eyes on him. He felt as if his colleagues were whispering about what happened. He saw Sergeant Davis across the room. He was leaning against a desk with a clipboard in hand. Jenkins could tell Davis wasn't in a good mood. Davis looked up, catching Jenkins's eye, and the frustrated look on his face softened as he gave him a slight nod. Jenkins swallowed hard and began making his way over, with each step, the weight of the moment growing heavier. "Are you ready for this?" Davis asked in a low, firm voice. There was no judgment in his tone, just the formality of what was about to go down. Jenkins nodded, though he didn't feel anywhere near ready. "Yeah," he said, his voice little more than a whisper. "I'll do what I need to do." Davis stared at him for a moment, then nodded slightly. "Good. You'll have to go into the captain's office in a bit. They're reviewing the incident, and they'll call you in when they're ready. Just keep your head on straight, own up to it, and don't try to dodge responsibility. That's the only way you're going to get through this." He nodded again, but his stomach roiled at the idea of facing the captain. "I'll handle it," he muttered, though even he wasn't sure how. Davis gave him a friendly pat on the shoulder and quickly walked away, leaving Jenkins standing right in the middle of the precinct. He looked around, feeling the tension in his body rise. He knew he had to face the music, but first, he knew he had to figure out just how he was going to make things right with Renee. He knew it would not be an easy feat. An apology would by no means right the wrong he had done, but he couldn't let this end without at least reaching out to her. He owed that much to her. But how does one apologize for treating someone the way he had treated her? How does he even start to apologize for his actions? Jenkins took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves as he walked over to his desk. His computer screen flickered on, and he sat there for a moment, staring at it. He couldn't focus on anything at the moment. His whole focus was on getting past the shitstorm he found himself in. He had no way of getting in contact with Renee. Her address had been listed on her license, but showing up at her house unannounced was probably not the best thing for him to do. And calling her, well, was that appropriate to do? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching his desk. Jenkins looked up to see Officer Kelly standing there, arms crossed, a curious look on his face. "You all right, Jenkins?" Kelly asked, though his tone was more curious than concerned. Jenkins forced a tight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine." Kelly raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. "Heard you had a rough night last night." Jenkins stiffened slightly, his heart racing, as he could already sense the rumors going around the department. "Something like that," he mumbled, hoping Kelly wouldn't push the subject any further. Kelly leaned against the edge of the desk, giving Jenkins a quick summary of what people were saying about him and the incident last night. Jenkins had expected people to talk, but he didn't expect it to have spread so far. At this rate, chances were officers from other counties might hear about it too. Jenkins' lips firmed and his temper began to rise. Of course, people were talking. That's what always happened. And it would take no time before the whole department knew the good details of his mistake. "Yeah, well, let them talk," Jenkins grumbled, turning back to his computer screen as he tried to end the conversation. Kelly stayed for a moment longer, then shrugged. "Just watch your back, man. These sorts of things have a way of getting out of hand if you're not careful." Jenkins didn't respond. He didn't need Kelly to remind him how much worse this could get. He knew that already. When Kelly walked away, Jenkins leaned back in his chair and rubbed one hand over his face. The weight of what was happening was crushing him, and he hadn't even seen the captain yet. A few moments later, Jenkins' phone buzzed on the desk. His heart skipped a beat as he read the message. It was from the captain's office. They were ready for him. Slowly, Jenkins got to his feet and walked down the hall. His legs felt heavy as if they had a mind of their own and had decided not to take the steps leading him there. Every step seemed like a walk to his death. The familiar corridors were now longer than he had ever remembered. He reached the captain's office and paused, taking a deep breath before knocking on the door. "Come in," the deep voice called from inside. Jenkins pressed the door open and stepped inside the office. Captain Reyes sat behind his desk, his hands folded in front of him. His face had a serious expression, and he glared piercingly at Jenkins as he looked up. Officer Jenkins, Reyes said, hand gesturing to him to take a seat. Take a seat. He sat, his heart slamming in his chest. He'd been in this office a great many times before, but never like this. Never with the weight of a potentially career-ending mistake hanging over his head. We've received a formal complaint, Reyes said, from a Colonel Renee Thompson. Jenkins nodded. His palms had become cold and soaked with sweat. Yes, sir. Reyes leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Jenkins's face. I have read the report. Do you care to explain what happened? Jenkins swallowed hard. His throat was dry. This was it. There was no going back now. I made a mistake, sir. Without cause and all, I pulled her over. Things got out of hand, and I treated her in a manner that was unprofessional. I crossed the line. Reyes's face gave no clue as to what he was thinking as Jenkins spoke. He only stared steadily at Jenkins. Finally, Reyes nodded slowly. It certainly would appear that you are aware of the gravity of this situation. I am, sir, said Jenkins more quietly, and I want to take full responsibility. Reyes leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Colonel Thompson is not any civilian. She's a person of rank, respect, and connections. This could go really bad, Jenkins. Jenkins nodded. He could feel the pool of sweat sticking to his uniform. I understand. Reyes fell silent for a moment and leaned forward again. I'm not going to make any promises about what comes next. We're going to investigate this thoroughly, and you need to prepare yourself for whatever comes out of that. But for now, I would suggest you start by trying to make amends to Colonel Thompson. You've got a long road ahead of you. Yes, sir. Reyes gave him a long, hard look. Go. Take the rest of the day. You'll hear from us soon. Slowly, Jenkins rose to his feet. It was as if the floor was falling out from beneath him. Leaving the captain's office and stepping back into the hallway, he felt completely drained from the situation. It was a long way to go. The worst of it was that he knew whatever he would do now, things could never be the same again. Jenkins drove home in silence. The weight of everything from his day was weighing him down, from the incident to his discussion with Officer Kelly, and then his meeting with the captain. Captain Reyes's words still circled in his head. This could have serious consequences. It was something he had expected before entering the captain's office, but the realization that it was actually going to cost him scared him more than he wanted to admit. He had hoped, somehow, that he could salvage this, that maybe if he owned up to it, he could limit the damage. But now, it was clear that this was beyond his control. He turned into his driveway, pulled in, and sat there, staring at the front of his house for a long time. He couldn't bring himself to get up and go inside. How was he supposed to act like everything was all right when his whole career was hanging by a very slim thread? Jenkins let his forehead drop against the steering wheel and closed his eyes, letting the air out in a raw hiss. He felt like he was drowning, and there was nobody there to help him. He knew the complaint was only the opening chapter. He knew what was coming from the follow-up meetings, investigations, and interviews. Everything he had done for the past 6 weeks was going to be torn open and scrutinized. Every mistake he'd ever made would be on display for anyone to see. And then there was Renee. Jenkins' mind was stuck with the image of her standing there with no emotion on her face, while he completely lost control. Seared in his mind was her quiet strength, her refusal to be intimidated. He had not only disrespected her as a person, he had disrespected everything she stood for. The more he thought about it, the deeper he realized how deep the damage went. With a heavy sigh, Jenkins finally made himself get out of the car and head inside. The house was too quiet, uncomfortably so, and it did nothing to take the tightness from his chest. He tossed his keys onto the counter and fell onto the couch, staring blankly at the wall. His mind was racing. All he could think about was that night. Something needed to be done from his side. He had to do something to at least try to make this right. Jenkins' hand went to his phone, already scrolling through contacts. He didn't have any direct contact lines for Renee, but he knew someone who would. He spent some moments trying to decide if it was the best play for him. But at this point, he couldn't stay and do nothing. He picked up the phone and dialed up the civilian affairs liaison for the police department, a woman named Karen, who was in charge of complaints and formal inquiries. She'd be the person who'd work with Renee on the complaint, and Jenkins figured she would be his best attempt at getting to her. The telephone rang a few times before Karen's soft voice filtered through the line. "Civilian Affairs, Karen speaking." "Karen, it's Jenkins," he said, his voice a bit too tight. I need to talk to you about a complaint that's been filed. It's about me." There was a brief pause on the other end, and then Karen's voice smoothed. "Jenkins, yeah, I've heard about it. What's going on?" Jenkins let out a long, sighing breath, working to control the tone of his voice. "I made a mistake, Karen. I made a bad call, and I'd like to try and make it right. Would there be any chance I could speak with Colonel Thompson? I know she's filed a formal complaint, but I need to apologize. I need to tell her how sorry I am." Karen fell silent for a moment, and Jenkins could almost hear her weigh her response. Finally, she spoke. "Look, Jenkins, I get that you want to apologize, but you need to understand something. This isn't just about making amends with her. This is a formal process now. She's filed the complaint, and it's out of her hands. You can't just smooth this over with an apology." "I know that," Jenkins said. "I am not trying to avoid the process. I need her to know that I am sorry about the way I treated her. I need her to know that." Another pause. Then Karen let her breath out noisily. "All right, Jenkins. I do what I can. I cannot promise you anything, but if I get hold of her number, I'll let her know you need to speak with her." "Thank you," Jenkins said, his chest re-low with a mix of anxiety and relief. "Don't get your hopes up. She might not want to hear from you. This isn't something that can be fixed with a conversation." "I understand," Jenkins muttered, "but I have to try." They hung up, and Jenkins sat there for a moment, staring at his phone. He wasn't expecting forgiveness. He wasn't even expecting Renee to agree to speak with him. But he had to try. He couldn't let this end without trying to take responsibility, without at least offering an apology. Whether she accepted it or not, he had to face her. Time ticked on, and Jenkins sat by the phone. Each second felt like he had spent an eternity waiting already. He didn't know what he was waiting for, but he could not lose hope. He might get lucky and receive an update from Karen, or maybe even a call directly from Renee, though he knew that probably wouldn't happen. The waiting made Jenkins hysteric as he paced around his apartment, willing the phone to ring. It was getting late already, and Jenkins was about to give up when the phone rang. Jenkins lunged for it from the table, his heart beating wildly as Karen's name flashed on its screen. He answered in a rush so that the word was out before he could control it. "Karen?" "Yeah, it's me," Karen said. "I spoke to Colonel Thompson. She's willing to meet with you. But let me make one thing clear. This isn't some kind of official part of the complaint process. This is just her agreeing to hear you out." Jenkins felt a wave of relief crash into him. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I appreciate it." "I'm sending you her itinerary for tomorrow," Karen said. "But Jenkins, don't go into this expecting her to forgive you. She's agreed to meet, but that doesn't mean she's going to let this go. Understand?" Jenkins nodded, although Karen couldn't see him. "I understand. I just need to speak to her." Karen exhaled slowly. "Good luck, Jenkins. You'll need it." The call was through, and Jenkins sat back, his heart racing. This was his only chance to face Renee and apologize for everything he had done, but he felt nervous about meeting her. What would he say to her, really? How could he ever hope to make amends for the way he treated her? The next day came quickly. He barely slept at all that night. He had dreamt of several scenarios of how the meeting went down. In one of his dreams, Colonel Thompson had chased him around that same neighborhood, trying to arrest him. He woke up screaming and covered in sweat. By the time he pulled into the parking lot of the small cafe where he and Renee were supposed to meet, he was a mess. His hands were jittery and wet with sweat. He took a deep breath in an attempt to steady himself before walking into the cafe. The cafe was quiet, the late morning crowd having thinned out. Jenkins spotted Renee almost immediately. She sat at a table near the window with a cup of coffee in front of her in her typically calm and composed pose. She wasn't surprised to see him. She barely looked up when he approached. "Colonel Thompson," Jenkins said quietly, his voice thick with nerves as he gripped the table clothing to hide his trembling hand. "Thanks for agreeing to meet with me." Renee finally looked up, her expression blank. She motioned to the chair opposite her. "Have a seat." He sat down at the table, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the tension in the air. Despite the fact he had rehearsed what he was going to say 100 times, now that he sat across from her, the words seemed to disappear. Renee sipped her coffee, her eyes never leaving his. "You wanted to speak with me, so speak." Jenkins swallowed hard, his throat dry. I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For everything." Renee didn't respond and didn't give him any indication of how she felt. She just watched him and waited. "I treated you like a criminal," Jenkins continued, his voice stumbling. "I disrespected you, and I let my own biases, I let my assumptions take control. I made a mistake, and I'm sorry." Renee leaned back in her chair, eyes still sharp and unreadable. "You did more than make a mistake, officer. You made a choice. You chose to see me as a threat before you even knew who I was. You chose to treat me with suspicion because I didn't fit the image of someone you think belongs in that neighborhood." Jenkins felt her words slice deep, and he knew she was right. "I know, and I can't undo what I did, but I want to make sure it never happens again." Renee's expression didn't soften. "You should have thought about that before you pulled me over for no reason." Jenkins nodded, the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. "I know. I'm sorry." For a very long moment, Renee just stared at him, her eyes boring deep into his face. Then, finally, she set her coffee cup on the table and rose to her feet. "I don't need your apology, Officer Jenkins. What I need is for people like you to do better, to see people for who they are, not who you assume they are." Renee rose to her feet, her words hanging in the air like a challenge. Jenkins knew this was his last chance to make any meaningful difference. He had come here to apologize, but her response made it crystal clear that words alone wouldn't fix what he had done. "I understand," Jenkins said quietly, though the weight of the moment made him feel anything but sure. "You have every right to feel that way." Renee gave him a long, hard look. "Do I? Or are you just saying that because it's what you think I want to hear?" The question came out like a blow, and Jenkins shrank in under the weight of that gaze. He hadn't expected this conversation to go smoothly, but he really hadn't recognized just how deeply his actions had hurt and disappointed her. "I am not saying it because it is what you want to hear," Jenkins said with a quaver in his voice. "I am saying it because it is the truth. I know that I can never take back what I have done, but at least maybe I will be able to try and do better. I must do better." Renee's expression didn't soften. If anything, Her gaze was even more piercing. "And what, pray tell, does better look like for you, Officer Jenkins? Is it better because you didn't treat me the way you did just because of my rank? Or is it better because you change how you view people like me?" Jenkins swallowed, his heart racing as he tried to think of something, anything, that could make her understand he was serious. But the truth was, he did not have all the answers. He did not know how to undo years of inbred bias and assumptions. He did not know how to suddenly become the kind of person who would never make this mistake again, but he knew he had to try. "I don't know," Jenkins said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to fix this, but I'm going to learn. I'm going to listen. And I'm going to make sure that the next time I'm in a situation like this, I don't make the same mistake." For a moment, Renee stood there, looking him over as if trying to gauge if he was actually being sincere. Then, slowly, she nodded. "That's a start," she said softly. "But it's not enough. This isn't just about you. This is about the entire system you're part of. You need to make sure people around you do better too. Most police officers also make the same assumptions and mistakes." Jenkins nodded fast, his heart thumping. "I do. I promise." Renee still didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue the point either. She merely reached across the table and slung her purse over her shoulder. "Apologies are great, Officer Jenkins, but they aren't anything without action. If you really want to make this right, you have to start doing the work. That means looking at yourself and the system you represent." Jenkins knew she was right. So much of his career had been predicated on being the good guy. But now, he realized just how flawed that mindset had been. He wasn't seeing people for who they were. He had been seeing them through the narrow lens of his assumptions. "I'll do it," Jenkins said, his voice sure despite the weight of everything crashing down on him. "I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Renee gave him a little, barely perceptible nod. "I hope you do. Because there are a lot of people out there who can't afford to wait for you to figure it out." With that, she turned and walked towards the door, leaving Jenkins seated at the table, reeling in his mind. He watched her go, the sound of the cafe door closing behind her. Jenkins didn't move from the chair. He just sat there, thinking about everything she had said. He had come here hopeful his apology would make headway in hopes of making things right. But now, he knew this was just the beginning. An apology wasn't enough and would never be enough. He knew he had to change. He needed to face that part of himself that led him to make those quick judgments, treating Renee and every black or brown person like her as less than others. Jenkins heaved a long sigh as if the weight of the moment had settled in. It wasn't going to be easy. The kind of change Renee was talking about didn't happen overnight. It was a process of time and effort. But he had to try. Slowly, Jenkins got up and walked towards the door. The instant he stepped outside, cold air hit him, but it did nothing to alleviate the tension in his chest. He walked toward his car, his mind still racing while trying to work out everything that had happened. He let out another shaky breath as he slid into the driver's seat. He couldn't undo what he had done, but he could take a first step in the right direction. And that was what he was about to do. Jenkins knew things were different the next day as he stepped inside the precinct. He could notice the shift in glances from his fellow colleagues and how conversations immediately stopped after he walked past. The complaint had already circulated, and everyone now knew what happened. The pressure felt so much more now as he glanced around the precinct, a weight not just of his guilt, but of the scrutiny of his peers. He had always felt he was a respected man in the department, an officer anyone could count on. Now, he stood on the outside looking in, as if he no longer fitted in as well as he had in times gone by. He wasn't certain whether it was just all in his head or whether his colleagues were actually treating him differently. But either way, he knew everything was changing. His first awakening was when Officer Kelly walked by his desk without saying anything to him. He started acting standoffish. Jenkins felt he was being kept at arm's length. Others would not even make eye contact. It was hurtful, but Jenkins knew fully well that the only one he should blame was himself. Sergeant Davis had been blunt enough regarding what was going to happen. A formal investigation, a review of his actions, and possible disciplinary actions against him. Jenkins knew he was in for a rough road ahead, but he had already decided that he wouldn't fight it. He couldn't. Whatever punishment came his way, he would take it. It was the least he could do after everything. But he couldn't help but worry about it. How long would the investigation take? What would the result be? And was it even possible for him to keep his job after this? All these questions whirled within his head, yet he couldn't find answers. With time, Jenkins threw himself into his work for the day, but his conscience was heavy with guilt. It sat around him, like a shadow following him everywhere. The following day, the internal investigation kicked off immediately, and Jenkins was summoned in for his formal interview. Jenkins sat in the small conference room across from the internal affairs officers of the department and felt exposed. They asked him very specific questions regarding the incident, including questions about his mindset at the time, and pressed him for his reasons for escalating the situation with no cause. Jenkins answered truthfully, but with each admission, another nail went into his coffin. He described how assumptions had led to his actions, how he had failed to recognize his own bias, and how much he deeply regretted what happened. But however much he wished to, he couldn't justify his actions. There was no excuse. And the more he talked, the more he realized just how deeply he had failed. At the end of the interview, Jenkins just sat and silently watched as the internal affairs officers discussed amongst themselves. With every look, every note jotted down, he could feel his judgment. They thanked him for his cooperation, but their voices were cold and professional. He knew this wasn't over, that his future with the department was still in question. As Jenkins stepped out of the conference room, it weighed in on him once again. The investigation is not complete, but apparently, the end result was inevitable. Nothing would ever be the same again, whether he retained his job or not. But maybe that was the point. He knew now that he had to change, not just as an officer, but as a person. The road ahead was long, and there were no guarantees that he would ever fully atone for what he had done. But he had to try. He owed that to Renee, and to himself. It all felt like some kind of nightmare in slow motion as the days of suspension went by. It was as if it had been a blow that he had never quite registered at the time when Captain Reyes had initially told him he was being suspended without pay for a period of 60 days. But now, sitting in the quiet of his apartment, he was coming to terms with reality. He had submitted the badge he had worn for years, the uniform that had become a part of his being. Jenkins wondered how he was going to survive for 2 months without his job. It wasn't just the money, though it was part of it. He had always been responsible with his finances. Jenkins knew the 60 days of no payment would hurt, but he could survive. That knot of anxiety tightened in his stomach each time he thought about just how thin his savings would be stretched. He had just never been in a situation like this before. However, what bothered him much more was losing his place in this world. As long as he could remember, being a police officer was his identity. It wasn't just a job, it was his identity. He liked the sense of purpose it gave him, the feeling that he was contributing to something bigger than himself. Now, that sense of belonging, of being part of something important, was gone. All that was left was the quiet and the gnawing sense that he had failed not just as an officer, but as a person. Each morning of his suspension, Jenkins found himself waking up early in the mornings, the same way he did while on the force. But instead of getting dressed in his uniform and going to the precinct, he sat in his kitchen with a cup of coffee, staring at the empty table and wondering how he'd gotten here. The minutes ticked by slowly, and with absolutely nothing to distract him, his mind kept drifting back to that night with Renee Thompson. The image ran over and over again in his brain, like a film jammed on repeat. He could still see her face, calm, composed, yet firm in a way that had unsettled him. He had felt so sure of his authority, so convinced he was in control. But he had been proven wrong. He sat alone with his thoughts and realized just how wrong he had been. It was a self-made sort of authority, grounded on assumptions and prejudices he hadn't even known he'd harbored. Jenkins had considered calling his colleagues during his suspension, but every time he picked up the phone, he put it down again. He wasn't sure how his colleagues saw him anymore. The precinct had always been his home, the one place he knew he fit in, but as the days rolled by, he wasn't so sure. The looks he'd gotten when he'd left after his meeting with Captain Reyes still hurt. Some of his fellow officers had seemed sympathetic, but others had completely avoided him like a plague, avoiding his gaze. It was like they needed to be clear of him, as if his mistake was some sort of stain. Even his closest colleague, Officer Kelly, had kept him at arm's length. Jenkins had always trusted Kelly to shoot straight with him, but even their conversations had seemed strained of late. Kelly hadn't said anything directly to him, but he could sense the shift in his friend. There was a new tension between them, a kind of unspoken judgment hanging in the air. Maybe Kelly didn't trust him anymore. Maybe none of them did. By the first week's end, the isolation was unbearable. Jenkins found himself pacing his small apartment in restlessness, with nothing to do but think. He had never realized how much his life had revolved around his job until it was taken away. Without the structure of work, he felt lost, unsure of what to do with himself. The free time he was usually up for now began to feel like a burden. His attempts to watch television failed. Nothing seemed to hold his attention for long. Silence filled the apartment, seeming to grow louder with each passing day. He considered taking a walk outside, but even the thought of being out amongst people put him at odds. What if someone recognized him? What if they knew about the suspension? Jenkins retreated inside, more inside his own mind. The more he thought about the incident with Renee, the more he came to realize how blind he actually had been. He had taken pride in being a good cop, one who upheld the law impartially and treated people decently. That night had given him quite a jolt into reality. He hadn't been seeing people for what they were. He was seeing them through lenses of suspicion, assumptions, and prejudice. Renee had seen right through him. He had treated her like she didn't belong, as if some kind of threat, and she calmly and firmly put him in his place, letting him know that she, too, was a person, a human being just like he was. Not only that, but she was an army colonel, one who had served her country, one who deserved his respect from the moment he stopped her. Instead, he had acted arrogantly with her, with an entitled authority given by his own insecurity rather than any justice. As days of suspension dragged on, Jenkins was facing the reality he had been avoiding for many years. Something had gone wrong in the way he went about his job. He felt he did everything in his power to live right. Yet now he could distinctly see how he had allowed his prejudgments to decide most of his actions. He judged too quickly, assumed too quickly, and that made him commit awful mistakes. And one of them had led him here. As Jenkins entered the third week of suspension, money started to be stretched thin. Jenkins could pay for his rent and bills with his savings, but the stress he got from just looking at his bank account dwindling added much pressure to him. He found himself avoiding the grocery store, stretching what little he had left in his pantry, making meals out of canned goods and frozen leftovers. He canceled the few subscriptions he had, tried to cut down on electricity, and avoided driving to save on gas. It was a humbling experience, one that made him realize how fragile his sense of security had been. It was uncertain without that steady paycheck, without that job that was always there. It wasn't just the money, though. The real cost had come in how his sense of self had been shattered. Jenkins had thought of himself for so long as a protector, someone upholding the law and keeping the community safe. But now, he wasn't so sure. He could no longer bear the badge he once proudly wore on his chest. It had turned into a cold reminder of his failure. Not only had he let down the department, but also the individuals he was supposed to be protecting. The quiet isolation of his apartment provided him with enough time to reflect on his actions, and even though it might dent his pride, he knew this suspension was deserved. It was making him confront areas of himself he had never wished to see. He thought about the required training he did before the suspension, how badly it had gone because of having to sit through bias sessions and hearing various stories of people who had been at the receiving end of police misconduct. He had listened then, but not really. He had been too intent on getting back to work, too anxious to put it all behind him. But without this job to divert his attention now, Jenkins had no other option but to face the bitter truth. He had been part of the problem. He had let his position blind him as regards the discriminatory way he was treating people, and it was Renee who had opened his eyes. By the time the 4th week of his suspension rolled around, Jenkins knew he had to do more than just sit and wait out the 30 days. He would have to take some real steps in order to make sure this would never happen. He couldn't go back to the way things were before. Planning took up the last days of his suspension. Jenkins called community organizations to learn ways he could get involved in the work being done to address bias and improve police-community relations. He wanted to be a better cop, no doubt, but more importantly, he wanted to be a better person. The suspension had taken much away from Jenkins, but it gave him one thing he had not expected: clarity. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a very long time, Jenkins was beginning to feel he was going in the right direction. The day he went back to the precinct after his suspension was difficult. The 60 days on suspension without pay had been a big wake-up call, more than anything else. Not only had he faced his failure, but he also knew that as he went into that building again, things would not be the same as before. It had been his second home for years, a place where he was confident and respected. As he pulled into the parking lot, Jenkins wasn't quite so sure how much of that confidence or respect would still be waiting for him. He always took great pride in his reputation as a reliable officer. Still, he couldn't help but know his suspension had changed the way people looked at him. As he got out of his car and headed toward the entrance, Jenkins could feel the tension in his shoulders. It wasn't just work he was walking back into. It was the aftermath of a mistake that had rippled through the department. People knew about the incident with Renee Thompson, and while he hadn't lost his job, he knew his career had been permanently affected. The doors slid open, and Jenkins stepped through, greeting himself with the familiar sounds of the precinct. Phones ringing, officers talking, shuffling papers. Yet something was different in the way people moved around him now. Gone were the nods and friendly greetings. In their place, he could feel eyes upon him and subtle glances. He felt the shift. He wasn't Officer Jenkins, the cop people trusted. He was Officer Jenkins, the guy who got suspended for letting his biases get the best of him. Sergeant Davis was waiting near the front desk for him. His usual expression hinted at concern as Jenkins approached him. "Jenkins," he said, nodding once as Jenkins came up. "Welcome back." Jenkins nodded, but he still felt skeptical. "Thanks, Sergeant." Davis gave him a quick rundown, as if trying to determine how Jenkins was holding up. "You ready to get back to it?" Jenkins wasn't quite sure how to answer that. Was he ready? He'd had 2 months to think about his actions, to reflect on what had gone wrong, but he didn't know if he was truly prepared for what it would feel like to step back into the role of an officer. Still, he had to start somewhere. "I'm ready," Jenkins said, though his voice didn't carry quite the same level of confidence it once did. Davis did not press it, and yet there was an understanding between them. He could see in Jenkins's eyes how heavy the burden weighed on his conscience, and this was not about picking up where he had left off. "Let's take it easy," Davis said after some seconds. "You will start with desk work for the first few days. We'll ease you back in." Jenkins nodded, relieved that he wouldn't be thrown straight back into patrol. He wasn't sure he was ready to be back out on the streets yet. The idea of pulling someone over or making those split-second decisions again made his stomach turn. Desk work, at least for now, felt safer. "All right," Jenkins said, his voice stronger this time. "I'll take it slow." Davis clapped him on the shoulder, a fleeting gesture of camaraderie, before turning back toward his office. "Good, we'll talk more later." The second Davis was out of sight, Jenkins exhaled slowly. He hadn't even made it past the front desk yet, and the weight of the day was already crushing him. He walked through to the back of the precinct, trying to shut out the look on people's faces. Some of the officers he passed gave him short nods. Others wouldn't even meet his eyes. It was almost as though there was a wall between himself and everybody else that hadn't existed before. When Jenkins reached the small desk that had been assigned to him, he sat down and let out another breath. The desk was cramped, and the pile of paperwork waiting for him didn't look particularly inviting. Still, it was a start. He needed to ease back into things and rebuild his place in the department. But sitting there, sorting through the files, Jenkins couldn't get rid of that feeling that something bigger was going on. His suspension had stirred something up, and now everyone walked on eggshells. Jenkins caught snatches of the conversations of the officers. He wasn't wrong. New policies, changed procedures, and in-service training sessions were being scheduled department-wide. Jenkins wasn't surprised. His incident with Renee had sent ripples through the ranks, and it seemed like the powers that be were determined to make sure that it didn't happen again. Later that day, Jenkins found himself in a meeting with Captain Reyes, Sergeant Davis, and a few other senior officers. The mood in the room was serious, the kind of atmosphere that told Jenkins they weren't here to talk about routine matters. Reyes sat at the head of the table, his expression as unreadable as ever, but there was tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. "We need to talk about the elephant in the room," Reyes began, his voice smooth, even, and yet granite firm. The suspension of Jenkins wasn't just some mistake by one officer. It went deeper, right up to the top, problems within this department, and we're going to have to answer to that. Jenkins had known this was coming, but to hear it laid out this bluntly made it all the more real. It wasn't about him anymore. The whole department was answerable for what kind of culture had let his behavior go unnoticed all these years. "We have listened to the community," Reyes said, looking around the room. "There's a lot of concern about the way we do our business. We can't run away from that. We need to take it head on." Jenkins shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He knew his suspension had served as more than a wake-up call for himself, but also for the department to begin to take stock of some very hard realities about how they did business and the way in which they were viewed by the community. What happened with Renee was only the tip of the iceberg. "We're institutionalizing new training," Reyes said, his voice brooking no argument. "Mandatory for everybody. We're also reviewing all of our policies about stops and detentions. We need to make sure what happened with Jenkins doesn't happen again." Jenkins listened silently. He had been the catalyst for these changes, but it wasn't something he could take pride in. He knew that his actions had forced the department to take a hard look at itself, and while that was necessary, it didn't erase the fact that he had been part of the problem. Davis now spoke, his voice measured. We're also going to be increasing community outreach. We need to rebuild trust, and that's going to take time. But we have to start somewhere. The officers continued talking, discussing what the department would do to repair the damage that was done. Jenkins just sat, absorbing it all in. All of his life, he had seemed to think of himself as one of those persons who were part of the solution, persons doing good for the community. But now he realized how much work lay ahead, not just for the department, but for himself. Jenkins had stayed behind in the corridor after the meeting, taking in everything that had been said. The changes to be done were necessary, but equally were a reminder of how much went wrong. Standing lost in thoughts, Davis came up to him. "Jenkins," Davis said softly, "you okay?" Jenkins nodded, though in reality he was not so sure. "Yeah, it's a lot to take in." Davis nodded. "I know that, but you're a part of this too. The changes we make are not only for the department, but for you too. You gotta put in the work." Jenkins knew Davis was right. The suspension, the training, the new policies, they were just the beginning. The real work would come in the days and weeks ahead as he tried to rebuild not just his career, but his sense of purpose. "I will," Jenkins said. Davis clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. We've got a long road ahead, but we're all in this together." As Jenkins watched Davis walk away, he felt a sense of resolve settle over him. The road ahead wasn't clear. For the first time since his suspension, he felt ready to go into battle. He had much to prove to the department, to the community, and to himself. He was ready to atone.